Oh, hey, everybody. It's good to see you. Or I suppose, actually, I'm not seeing you, but you are seeing me, and that's good. I'm glad for that. So, this might sound really random, but I promise you it's not. I am pretty sure that the Apostle Peter was a terrible fisherman. And I'm not trying to shame the guy. I'm not trying to make fun of anybody. I'm not trying to sit here and, he was a hardworking man who was just trying to provide for his family by taking the jobs that were available to him. I get it, but I'm pretty sure he was terrible. And it's not that I'm saying that because I'm making it up. I'm saying it because the New Testament tells us about his fishing, and it's not great. There are three times when the Apostle Peter we see fishes, and two of them are a disaster, just a train wreck, and one of them I'm not totally sure should count. So the one, let's give him the credit for the one. The one is a story I'm pretty sure we talked about this year at some point, where there were some people who were criticizing Peter and criticizing Jesus for not paying the temple tax. It was a whole thing about taxes in Rome and all that we talked about. And Jesus didn't think he needed to do this. He didn't think that it was necessary or even appropriate for him to be paying the tax. But he said, well, I don't want to offend anybody. So he told Peter, go fishing. There's going to be this fish, in this specific place in the water. Drop your line down, and there'll be this fish, and inside the fish there'll be this coin in its mouth, and you can take the coin and pay our taxes with it. Now, look, I don't know exactly what the miracle is here. I don't know if it was miraculous knowledge, right? That Jesus just knew that there was a fish who just happened to have this coin in its mouth. That would be a miracle for sure. I don't know if it was that. I also don't know if instead Jesus kind of causes it, like he causes the fish to have the coin in its mouth. This fish is just swimming along, and there's the coin, and he eats it up, and Jesus is orchestrating all of this. I don't know, but what I know is that if Jesus says that there's a fish over there in that water, and it's got a coin in its mouth, that anybody can do it, right? Like, I have never fished in my life. I've never done it, but I am positive that if you gave me a rod and a reel and said, "Hey, Jesus said there's a fish over here with a coin in its mouth," that I could catch the fish and get the coin. That doesn't take skill. That just takes doing what Jesus said. So, look, that's a success, and that's good for him. But that's it. That is the entirety of the success of the Apostle Peter when it comes to fishing. The other two times are just a disaster, and they're really important to us. However, as we think about the story of the Bible and Peter and even Jesus, as we think about the whole thing, and so we should maybe talk about them, even though it was really a disaster for Peter. The first one of them happens the day that Peter meets Jesus. Jesus was teaching, and he had this whole crowd of people that were kind of all around him, kind of pressing in. And Jesus realized that, I want to teach and I want to preach and I want to help these people, but I need kind of a platform to speak from. And so he was kind of on the shore of the Sea of Galilee, and he said, okay, well, if I kind of go out, into the water a little bit in a boat, I can, speak to everybody, and I'll have kind of the natural amplification, and everybody will be able to hear me, and it'll be great. So he sees these fishermen, right? It was Peter and it was his brother Andrew, and they've got these buddies, James and John, and he says, "Hey, could I borrow one of your boats?" And Peter is there, and he says, "Yeah, no problem. No, it'd be great. Go have at it." And so Jesus ends up preaching from Peter's boat. After the sermon, Jesus, just trying to say thank you, just trying to be a nice guy, I'm guessing, goes to Peter and wants to reward him. And he says, "Hey, do me a favor and kind of go out one more time, and one more time today, and try to catch some fish." And Peter argued with him, right? He argued with him, and he said, "We have been fishing all night." He even says, "We worked hard all night trying to catch fish." And all night, despite our best efforts, despite all of our hard work, we caught nothing. Not like, didn't even catch a sardine. There's just nothing. We tried and we tried and we worked and we worked and we caught not a darn thing. And so he said, I don't want to do it. And Jesus says, "No, listen, trust me. Go ahead and go and go out there. And as you know, probably there's a miracle. They go out and they catch all these fish, and there's so many fish that it nearly tears their nets and it nearly sinks their boats, and it's almost all sorts of disaster. And the whole idea, in this story, the message of this story is always, the miracle of Jesus and the provision of Jesus and all these things. And this is kind of a launching point for Peter becoming a disciple, and not just Peter, but also Andrew and also James and John. And that's how the story always goes. But if we're just trying to evaluate Peter's fishing skills, and we're not trying to, do the other points, I'll be honest, this story tells us that Peter is really, really bad at his job. Now, look, I'm not pretending to know everything, but it seems to me that if you're going to fish, at a commercial level, it doesn't seem all that, difficult and from a strategic perspective. I know it's hard work. I know it is physically taxing work, but it's not like there's this great strategy to it, right? You get in your boat, you go in the water, you drop a giant net, and the fish just kind of swim into it, and then you pick it up when it's filled with fish. For Peter to fail at that all night through hard work, he just catches nothing. It's kind of an amazing thing. And I don't get the impression that this is the only night this ever happened. You kind of get the impression reading the story that this happens on a regular basis. And I got to tell you, again, I'm not an expert, but I'm given to the notion that the Sea of Galilee has a lot of fish in it. This is not something that should be happening at all. And yet for Peter, it's something that happens. And I think it's really significant. This is the incident, this is the story that leads Peter and the others, but we're going to talk about Peter. So Peter to follow Jesus. Well, we talked just a couple of weeks ago around here about the rich young ruler. And if you remember, right, there was this guy who was wildly successful. He had power, he had money, he had, his youth, he had just kind of everything. And Jesus invites him to be an apostle, to follow him, to be, be one of the disciples, the 13th apostle, so to speak. And the man turns Jesus down. And the explanation we are given is that the man had so much to lose that he didn't want to give it up. Meaning, the life that he had apart from Jesus was so good that he didn't want to follow Jesus and have to give up that life. He didn't want to get rid of his wealth. He didn't want to give up his possessions. He didn't want to give up his job, whatever it was. His life was successful, and therefore, he didn't want to follow Jesus. Well, in the story of Peter, with the fish and everything else, there is no hesitation. There is no, well, gee, should I go ahead and leave this boat? No, he drops the net. He leaves the boat. I get the impression that he just leaves all the fish behind. He is so done with being a fisherman because he's not good at it. He's not, there's nothing behind keeping him from following Jesus. He just has a job he's not any good at, and that's it. And he is all too happy to follow Jesus because he is miserable at being a fisherman. Okay, so of course, as the story progresses, as you guys, I'm sure, are aware, this is a good decision for Peter because he is so much better at being an apostle than he is at being a fisherman. He is so much better at being a follower of Jesus and Jesus as his rabbi than he is at fishing. Jesus said, hey, you're no longer going to be fishermen, you're going to be fishers of men. And Peter is a very good fisher of men. He as again, I'm sure you're aware, he rises up the ranks very quickly in the group of the disciples. He becomes part of Jesus' inner circle. He sees unique things like the transfiguration and other things that other disciples don't see. He quickly becomes one of the the spokesperson for the group. That he's the guy who articulates that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God, which is confession that Jesus says that God directly gave him, and also that's what the church is built on. So Peter is now somebody that God is speaking to, that the church is being built on. Like the world's largest religion today is built on what Peter directly said. He's wildly good, and it's not just even that. Like we are massively indebted to Peter. I don't know that we really think about this as often as we should, but he's not just like this character in the story. He is such a central figure right? Even down to this, the early church tells us that we get the gospel according to Mark from Peter. It's got Mark's name on it. But what would happen was Peter was traveling and preaching and teaching, and they didn't have recordings. They couldn't videotape him back then, and so Mark wrote down what Peter was teaching, and that becomes the first gospel, which then begets Matthew and begets, Luke and begets John. I mean, the concept of writing down the story of Jesus, the early church tells us that comes from Peter. And of course, on top of that, we have, First and Second Peter. We have all of these things. It's not too much to say that if we had a Mount Rushmore of Christianity, that Peter is on it. And all of that, we could have lost if not for the fact that he was a terrible fisherman. Peter, being a terrible fisherman, helps him make the decision to follow Jesus and helps him to become the man who builds everything that we have. But of course, it's not all, happiness and writing gospels. Things got hard, and things got particularly hard for Peter in a way that they didn't get hard for other people. For the same reason that he is a leader in the church, that he is at the forefront of everything, that's why it becomes really, really hard. So it starts out during the Last Supper, right? The difficulty for Peter starts at the Last Supper. Jesus gathers his disciples together, and he's giving them final instructions, and he's telling them kind of what his expectations are and what is going to happen to them in the future. And he's laying all this out, and Jesus kind of paints a bleak picture. He talks about how, hey man, you guys are going to be kicked out of the synagogues, you guys are going to be kicked out of the temple, you guys are going to be barred from the Jewish faith, you're going to be you're going to lose your friends, you're going to lose your family, you're going to lose everything, you're going to lose your lives, and he says the people who do this to you, they're going to think they're serving God, so there's not going to be any stopping them because they're going to be filled with this religious zeal, right? And Jesus tells them that, people are going to abandon it, and it's going to be hard. And Peter says to Jesus during this meal, listen, Rabbi, friend, it will never be me. He tells them, everybody else might abandon you. Everybody sitting here, everybody who's not sitting here, everybody else may abandon you and turn their back on you, but I'm never going to. Now, that's a bold claim, but we should understand where it's coming from. It comes from the fact that for Peter, Jesus is not just his rabbi. Jesus is his best friend. Jesus is his brother. Jesus is his family. Jesus is someone he would walk through fire for. Jesus is somebody that he would fight an army by himself for, which he does, or he tries. And so he tells Jesus, I would never abandon you. And Jesus tells him, look, not only would you, but you're gonna 3 times by the end of the night. And I don't think Peter believed that because, why would he? But eventually everything would kind of come crashing down on him. Like I said, Peter eventually does try to fight an army by himself for Jesus, and it's in the Garden of Gethsemane. They're arresting Jesus, and he pulls out a sword. And he goes to fight like this massive mob of Jewish and Roman soldiers, and I think Peter was shocked when Jesus, yelled at him. He rebuked him, he corrected him, and said, "Look, you're doing the wrong thing right now. I don't want you to fight. That's not what we're doing." And then I think, that kind of disappointment and disillusionment mixed then with, fear and watching your rabbi and best friend get arrested. Peter, angry and dejected and afraid, ends up that night denying Jesus 3 times, 3 separate times, just saying, look, I don't know Jesus at all. People would ask, and hey, I just don't know Jesus at all. And so he betrayed Jesus. He sinned. It was terrible. But I actually think that, that event, it's really, really famous, and that's definitely there. But I think that that's not the only thing that makes Peter Peter. I don't think that's the only negative thing that goes through Peter's head that night or in the coming days. I think instead of what we see is not only does that event happen, but in the coming days, the next days, it doesn't go the way Peter wants. Now look, I've already mentioned it. Jesus warned Peter and the rest that there were hard days to come. But what he really was warning was the negative things that happened to Jesus are going to shift to the apostles. That's really what he was saying. His whole ministry, people hated Jesus. His whole ministry, people opposed Jesus. And it culminated in the religious leaders of Israel handing Jesus over to the Romans to crucify him. What Jesus was telling his disciples during the Last Supper was, everything bad that's happening to me is going to happen to you. It's passing the baton. It's, this was me, and now this is you. And that's scary. When we see the disciples during the very first Easter Sunday, the first Resurrection Sunday, they're hiding. They're hiding. I mean, yeah, okay, so, a couple of them go to the empty tomb, but the rest of them, they're all hiding. And they're hiding because they know they could be and probably will be next. And I'm not sure Peter wanted that. I'm not so sure that Peter was interested in that. I think Peter had signed up to be a disciple of Jesus. Jesus had invited him to leave the fishing behind, to be a fisher of men. That's the invitation he had taken. He had not taken an invitation to lead a religious movement. That's not what he wanted. That's not what he had asked for. He had asked to follow Jesus. And you might be thinking, well, what about the resurrection? Surely the resurrection would change things. Sure, to a point, but only to a point. The thing we don't often think about with the resurrection being on this side of it, right? Like all of us, we're 2,000 years almost removed from the resurrection. So for us, this has always been a historical fact. The resurrection is a historical reality. It's something that happened a long time ago. But for the original disciples, for Peter, the resurrection was an event that happened right now, and it was not the event that we think about. Right? So I think that if you're Peter and you are excited for a resurrection, you might go something like this. Jesus has a ministry. Jesus dies. Jesus comes back from the dead. And now Jesus resumes his ministry. That's what you want out of the resurrection if you're Peter. But what happened was Jesus has a ministry. Jesus dies. Jesus raises from the dead. And then they resume the ministry. Every time we see Jesus after the resurrection, it's weird. Like he's kind of in and out. Like he shows people, hey guys, I'm alive. And then he talks to him for a while, and then he leaves again. He disappears. Over and over. I mean, he appears to hundreds and hundreds of people. But he never sticks around. At no point after Jesus' resurrection does he resume preaching. Does he resume performing miracles? Does he resume his ministry? It's over. The resurrection is an event that changes all of human history for eternity. But part of that change was that left the ministry to the apostles, to Peter. And so for Peter, he has a choice to make now. Do I want to do this? Do I want to be the leader of a movement that's a new religious movement that's going to anger everybody around me, that's going to make me an outcast? Do I want to do this? It's going to cost me my life. Is this something that I want? And I think the fact that Peter ends up saying, no, I don't want that, and the fact that Peter ends up going back to fishing should tell us something, given the fact that Peter is so bad at fishing. Like, I don't want to make light of this. Peter is a terrible fisherman. When he weighed out his options and he said, okay, I could go back to fishing or I could continue to be an apostle with Jesus gone, right? Like, I could take the baton and do what Jesus was doing. Logically speaking, you have something he's good at. He has demonstrated he's a good apostle, and something he's bad at. He has demonstrated he's a terrible fisherman. And he waited out and he chose fishing. Peter goes back to fishing. And I know the Bible just kind of describes it as, well, he went fishing one day, but we have to understand, Jesus explicitly said, you're not a fisherman anymore. You are a fisher of men. Jesus explicitly said, that is not the life you have anymore. This is not something this is not something he's doing for fun. This is something he's doing for a job, for his work. This is something Jesus had said, don't do that anymore. For Peter to go back fishing was for Jesus to say, I do not want to be an apostle any longer. And yet, even though he was so terrible at it, Peter, dejected, depressed, completely disappointed, goes back to a life he was awful at instead of continuing down the road that Jesus had for him. And this is what we read. The third time we see Peter fishing, this is what we read in the gospel according to John. It goes like this. Simon Peter said, I am going fishing. We'll come too, the disciples said. They all said. So they went out into the boat and they caught nothing all night. Because, of course, they're terrible. At dawn, Jesus was standing on the beach, but the disciples couldn't see who he was. He called out, fellows, have you caught any fish? No, they replied. Then he said, throw out your net on the right-hand side of the boat and you will get some. So they did. And they couldn't haul in the net because there were so many fish in it. Okay, we got to pause. I just have to point out how absolutely hilarious Jesus is. Okay? He didn't need to point out that they were such bad fishermen. He didn't have to say that. He could have, this whole story could go, and he wouldn't have to point out their failure. But Jesus, hilariously, because Jesus is hilarious, asks the question, y'all catch anything? And of course, the answer is no, because once again, Peter is awful at fishing. Okay, we can keep going now. After we just got to point out Jesus being hilarious. Here's what we read. Continuing the story, it says, then the disciple Jesus loved said to Peter, it's the Lord. When Simon Peter heard that it was the Lord, he put on his tunic, for he had stripped for work, jumped in the water, and he headed to shore. The others stayed with the boat and pulled the loaded net to the shore, for they were only about 100 yards from the shore. When they got there, they found breakfast waiting for them, fish cooking over a charcoal fire and some bread. After breakfast, Jesus asked Simon Peter, Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these? Yes, Lord, Peter replied. You know I love you. Then feed my lambs, Jesus told him. Jesus repeated the question, Simon, son of John, do you love me? Yes, Lord, Peter said, you know I love you. Then take care of my sheep, Jesus said. A third time he asked him, Simon, son of John, do you love me? Peter was hurt that Jesus asked the question a third time. He said, Lord, you know everything. You know that I love you. Jesus said, then feed my sheep. I tell you the truth. When you were young, you were able to do as you liked. You dressed yourself and went wherever you wanted to go. But when you are old, you will stretch out your hands and others will dress you and take you where you don't want to go. Jesus said this to let him know by what kind of death he would glorify God. And then Jesus told him, follow me. There's two things we need to point out about this story. Two amazing things. The first one's all the callbacks in this story. This whole incident is set up to make Peter remember. Like, it starts with the miracle. That first time they met, there was the miraculous catch of fish. That exact thing happens this time. There's a miraculous catch of fish. There's a whole night of not catching anything, and then Jesus says, hey, try one more time, stick the net over the water, and you'll catch fish. Same two incidents happened, okay? The thing that was at the beginning, and now here's the thing at this other time. So there's that. Second, we have, it was like the Last Supper, right? Jesus feeds them, meat and bread at the Last Supper. There was a Passover meal then, and so it's meat and bread. Well, this time it's fish and bread. Jesus feeding his disciples a meal, sitting down, and not just sitting down to eat a meal, but sitting down and feeding them a meal, just like the Last Supper. Then, just like Peter denied Jesus 3 times, Jesus gives Peter a chance to confess 3 times that not only does he know him, but that he loves him. Again, the symmetry is absolutely perfect. Peter could not have missed that was what was happening. He was hurt by it, but he could not have missed that, hey, I denied Jesus 3 times, and now he has 3 times. It even finishes with Jesus saying, follow me. The same invitation at the beginning of his ministry as now this. And I think that really kind of gives us the clue as to what's going on here, right? What's going on here is Peter's found himself at a crossroads. He decided to follow Jesus, but then when Jesus died and rose from the dead and did not resume his ministry, Peter decided not to follow Jesus anymore. He decided he didn't want to be an apostle. He decided he didn't want to, be part of this ministry. He decided he did not want to be somebody who carried the torch and took over and did what Jesus did with the stakes that Jesus had. And so Jesus was inviting him again to make the decision to follow him. It's the same invitation. Follow me, follow me. Peter, at this crossroads, reminded of what happened. The idea is simply this: with all of the callbacks, what Jesus was trying to tell Peter was, look, nothing's changed, right? Nothing has changed. The plans I have for you have not changed. The what's going to happen in the future has not changed. Nothing has changed. This was always going to happen. This was always the path. You may not have known it, but this was always the path. And so I'm asking you now, follow me, feed my lambs, take care of my sheep, do the job I gave you. That's the first thing. Jesus showing Peter nothing had changed. And then Jesus showed Peter that I got plans not for tomorrow and not for next year and not for 10 years from now. I got plans forever. Jesus references the sort of death Peter is going to die. Talks about he's going to stretch out his hands, other people are going to dress him and take places. He's referencing a crucifixion. Peter is crucified, just as Christ was. Well, not just. Peter requests that he is crucified inverted, upside down, because he wants not to be thought of like Jesus. He wants to honor Jesus in his death, but he's not Jesus. And so out of humility, he's crucified upside down. But Jesus says, I know how you're dying. You're going to die in a way that glorifies God. You will die a martyr. You will die like me. And what he's saying with that is, I have plans for your entire life. Just so we're clear, this conversation, somewhere around 30 AD. Peter's death, somewhere around 67, 68 AD. Peter's got another almost 4 decades that Jesus says, I've got you. I've got this. I will be with you all the way until your death. For Peter, this is a man who had sinned. This is a man who had turned his back on Jesus. This is a man who had turned his back on the path that God had laid out for his life. And Jesus was communicating that not only has nothing changed, your sin changes nothing, Peter. Absolutely nothing. It's the same as it ever was. But also, your decision to abandon this has not changed God's will, has not changed God's plans, and has not changed the fact that Jesus is going to be with you no matter what. For Peter, Jesus was promising, no matter what you are choosing, no matter what you're doing, I am with you, and I will be with you all the way to the end. And that brings us to this morning. This morning is New Year's Eve. This is a kind of a unique day for us as, a society, as a culture. New Year's Eve is kind of this unique moment where we look back on the last year while at the same time looking forward at the future, right? So today we kind of look back on 2023 and say, well, where have we been? What went well? What didn't go well? What did I do that was good? What did I do that was bad? And we can kind of look back and evaluate and say, who was I over the last year? And then also we look forward to 2024 and say, okay, what's going to happen in the next year? What do I want to be? What are my goals? What do I want to accomplish? Who do I want to be over the next 12 months? It's kind of a unique day where we look backwards and we look forwards. And I think it's really important that we understand the story of Peter, a terrible fisherman. And we understand that he found himself at this crossroads, looking back at what was and looking forward to what he wanted to be. And when he looked back at what was, he loved it, but looking forward, he didn't want it to change. I don't think that Peter ever denies Jesus if there's not the change. I don't think Peter ever goes back to being a fisherman if there wasn't the change. What was going on with Peter was he didn't like the change. He didn't like that I signed up to follow Jesus, and now Jesus is going to be gone, and I have to lead, and I don't want to do that. And so Jesus had to remind him, nothing really changed. This was always going to be the way it was. And I'm with you all the time. And look, guys, I have no idea what 2024 is going to be. It could be totally uneventful, and it could be a doozy. I have no idea. Nobody knows what's going to happen, tomorrow, much less the next 12 months. But what I know is that as much change is happening, nothing is changing about the gospel. Nothing is changing about the truth of Jesus. Nothing is changing about the truth of God. Nothing is changing about our mission as a church or our mission as people. Nothing is changing. The calendar may turn over, but the gospel is the gospel, and the truth is the truth, and Jesus is Jesus, and nothing's changing. But whatever happens, whatever comes, if we live this year and we don't live past the end of this year, right? If this is our last year here, or if we've got 38 more years, or whatever it is, right? Jesus is with us. God is with us, no matter what. And so here we are, embarking on a new year, closing the chapter of this, the book of our lives. This chapter is over. And as we open a new one, there's really just one lesson I feel like we need to say. And it's a lesson that we get from Peter. It's a lesson we get from Jesus. And it's a lesson that's for all of us. Our final lesson from the year 2023 is this. As the world changes, God's love and faithfulness never does. Christ does not give up even when we do. I realize now it's not on the PowerPoint because I forgot to do that. So I'm going to read it again. And it says, as the world changes, God's love and faithfulness never does. Christ does not give up even when we do. That is our last lesson for the year. That's our last sermon for the year. I say this every week. I try to say this. There's a lot of places you guys could have chosen to be, and I'm glad you're here. There's a lot of places you guys could have chosen to be this year, and you chose to be here, and I think that's absolutely amazing. And as we go into next year, there's a lot of places you guys could choose to be, and if you choose to be here, we will be grateful, and we will do absolutely our best to help each and every one of you as we try to follow Christ, so you guys follow Christ as well. That's going to be it. Really glad you guys are here. Thank you for listening, and Happy New Year.